Hello, it's Étienne Danchin again from the CNRS in Toulouse in France, and today I'd like to discuss the implications of animal culture for evolution. And I'd like to do this by trying to answer this question: what does the existence of cultural inheritance change in the process of evolution? And there are two key concepts in this question. The first one is the concept of inheritance, and the second one, the concept of evolution. And I'd like to structure my lecture with around these two concepts. The first part will be about inheritance, and the second part about evolution. So let's start with heredity, inheritance. By heredity, we usually mean patterns of parent-offspring resemblance. And there are two levels of resemblance. The first one is that cats don't make dogs, so it's an interspecific amongst species level of resemblance. But there is also a within species level of resemblance, which is the fact that big cats tend to make bigger cats than small cats. In other words, the babies inherit of all the traits of their parents. The second concept is important concept is the term inheritance, which I use to depict the underlying mechanisms that involve the transfer of any kind of information across generations. So these mechanisms are responsible for the production of this resemblance. And among these mechanisms, of course, there is genetics. And in particular, the genetic information, that is the information that is encoded into the DNA sequence. And I propose the term sequencing to depict this extremely reduced vision of genetics only to the information that is encoded into the DNA sequence. Once I've defined genetics that way, I can easily now define what is non-genetic inheritance. It's all the rest. Inheritance or phenotypic variation, the difference among people within a population, that doesn't result from DNA sequence variation. But you might be a bit surprised by this expression, non-genetic inheritance. It sounds a bit like an oxymoron somehow. So let's think a little bit about it. And to really understand this, I think it's important to come back to the origin of the thinking about natural selection. And the origin is a book by Darwin named The Origin of Species, where he wrote this sentence. He said, "Any variation which is not inherited is unimportant for us," implying that only the variation that is transmitted is important for natural selection. We can rephrase this sentence using modern concepts by saying that, in fact, trait variation, the fact that we are all different within a population, which we measure by trait variance, which we call V sub P, standing for phenotypic variance, has got two components. This is what Darwin says. A component, the part which is transmitted to the next generation that leads to parent-offspring resemblance, and the part that doesn't lead to parent-offspring resemblance that is not transmitted. And he further says that we can get rid of this term. Obviously, 160 plus years later now, we had added a really important box into this variance decomposition, which is genetic variation. The fact that all of us have got different DNA sequence. At some places, we've got some difference. All of us are different, are unique in their sequence of DNA. And this discovery of genetic has been probably one of the most fascinating discoveries of the 20th century, all science included. But it's been so fascinating that instead of decomposing variation the way Darwin suggested, that is this way, opposing transmitted versus non-transmitted, we now do it in a slightly different way by opposing genetic variation against the rest that we lump into a parameter that we call V sub E, environmental variation. And we do this because implicitly we are convinced that genetic variation is the only thing that really matters for evolution. This is engraved in our brains. So we want to purify it, to get the sugar of it, just the interesting part of variation. So to do this, we need to get rid of this term, which Darwin said we could get rid of. But we need also to get rid of this other term here, which is nonetheless part of belongs to the part that is transmitted to the next generation. So in wanting to purify genetics, somehow we kind of discard part of the baby with the bathwater. And this is because the real baby we want to study is not genetic variation, it's the variation that is transmitted to the next generation. The part of that leads, or variation that leads to parent-offspring resemblance, which I call inclusive heritability, because it includes any dimension of this inheritance. It could be genetics, of course, but it could be a suite of different processes that are not based on variation in DNA sequence. So you might be a little bit puzzled by this term, non-genetic inheritance, non-genetic term of variation that leads to parent-offspring resemblance. And in these papers, and as in many others, people have reviewed the evidence for the existence of this term. Coming from different fields, in our papers we were reviewing evidence from the field of epigenetics, social learning, ecological inheritance, and parental effects. But there are many other fields that all provide evidence for the strong evidence for the existence of this term. And if you want to read more about this, you may contemplate the idea of reading some of these papers, reviews specific cases and reviews and books even about this question. And there is one term which is really interesting for us in this slide, which is this term here. It's a part of phenotypic variation that is transmitted across generation through the non-genetic process of social learning. And with my colleague Richard Wagner in 2010, we proposed to use this term to provide a new definition of culture, animal culture, which is the part of phenotypic variation that is transmitted non-genetically through social learning across generations. So heredity would in effect produce fluxes of information across generations, generating informational dynamics over evolutionary time. And the question is now, what kind of intergenerational information fluxes are generated by cultural heredity? Are they of similar nature as the fluxes that are generated by genetic transmission, or are they of a different nature? Do they have different properties? And to answer that question, it's good to come back to the origin when Alexander Weismann separated what he called the germplasm, which is equivalent of what we now call genotype, and versus the soma, which we now call the phenotype. And Alexander Weismann produced a diagram that was extremely complex, but that was fortunately simplified in two steps, first by Wilson and then by John Maynard Smith in 1965. And here is a diagram by John Maynard Smith, slightly modified. The time is running from top to bottom. You've got 3 generations, and you've got the DNA sequence here. You've got the germline, you've got the soma with the phenotype, and of course, this white arrow represents development. And this diagram has been extremely influential. And since the 1960s, we've added 2 very important components to this diagram. The first one is that the environment is extremely influential during development, in shaping the phenotype, so generating variation in phenotypes. And the second point is that this effect of the environment is mediated somehow by the fine-tuning of gene expression during life and development in particular, which is a domain that we call epigenetics. So the 2 main additions are the important role of the environment and the importance of epigenetics, in this process. And to me, this represents the canonical vision of inheritance according to the modern synthesis of evolution, which is the mainstream vision of evolution, the vision that is accepted by the bulk of the people. Most of the people, be they scientists or not, have this vision. And I want to underline one important aspect of this diagram. You understood that these red arrows here represent the informational channel across generations. Genes are transmitted, DNA sequence is transmitted across generations, and we know the mechanisms to get this. But the important point is that in this diagram, there is only one red arrow, only one channel in which information is transferred according to this vision from one generation to the next. It is a model, and as every model, it's a simplification. But sometimes the simplification might, after having been positive, might become a constraint a kind of dogma somehow. And during the last 20, let's say 40 to 20 years, depending on when you start, you place the start of this vision, it is clear that we've accumulated a lot of information about the existence of other processes of transmission, one of which, of course, is cultural transmission, which is the main topic of this module, of course. Yeah, interesting. So what about cultural heredity? How would you place it on this diagram? Obviously, it is something that I learned from my parents, so that is transmitted across generations like this. You might say, oh, interesting, you've added a new red arrow in this diagram, but it looks very similar. If you look at this, it seems to be completely parallel to genetic transmission and looks like if it had the same properties as genetic transmission. And to show that this is not the case, it's important to focus on the transmission mode. To study this, the best way is to take one generation and take the next generation. And we know that genes, genetics, are transmitted vertically, purely vertically, from one generation to the next. All of my genes were transmitted either by my biological mother or by my biological father. No doubt about that. And this property is common to a lot of processes of non-genetic inheritance as well. Epigenetic inheritance, same pathway. Ecological inheritance, very similar pathway. Parental effect, exactly the same kind of pathway. So clearly, most of the processes are purely vertical. What about culture? Well, of course, culture has got a vertical component as well. For instance, if my natural language is French, it's because my parents used to speak French to me when I was a kid. So this is a vertical component of it. But there was another reason why I learned French. It's because my neighbors as well were speaking French. And so it is a case of oblique transmission, because it is non-king people from the generation before that taught to me this. But I also learned from my peers, from people of my same age. For instance, my slang was not transmitted to me by my parents or people from the previous generation, but by colleagues, same age people. So this is a unique originality of culture in that it is indeed vertical, but also horizontally and obliquely transmitted. And this has a potential to drastically affect the process of evolution. So this diagram is a bit misleading if you see it only like this. And to improve it, it's interesting to realize that this is a diagram that represents one family, one lineage from grandparents, parents, and current generation, and so on. But in a population, and you remember that the cultural property is a property not of the individuals, but of a group of individuals. In one population, there are many such families that are working in parallel, existing in parallel. And what clearly cultural heredity can do is to link these different families by transferring information horizontally or obliquely across many families, genealogies. And the consequence of this is that culture can spread across lineages very rapidly in just one generation, less than one generation. It can be extremely fast, which would be absolutely impossible with purely vertical processes, because with purely vertical processes, genes and other processes, it would need to have new innovations, then to be transmitted, then to be selected for many, many generations before it invades the whole population. Okay, now that we know a little bit more about what is heredity, let's talk about evolution. And a classical definition of evolution is that it is a process by which the frequencies of genes change over the generations. And it is classically accepted at the moment by all the people that today that there are two major processes. The first one is one everybody knows of, which is evolution through natural selection, which can occur, will occur, unavoidably as soon as three conditions are fulfilled. First, there should be variation. Individuals should be different, otherwise there is nothing to separate, to select. And clearly, this is what we've been dealing with during the first part of my lecture. This is phenotypic variation. This is V sub P. It's all over the place. The second is that there should be a consistent relationship between trait values and fitness. That is the capacity to have offspring, which depends on other capacities such as avoiding predators, acquiring mates, food, everything you can think of. And this condition, the second condition, is classically called selective pressure. And you can visualize it in a very simple way with a graph like this one, in which you've got on the x-axis the trait value, and on the y-axis the fitness. And it can be some shape like this, in which the extreme values are counter-selected, low fitness, while the individuals that are in the median size have got the highest fitness. And clearly a situation like this would stabilize the trait around these values. But it could be a completely different shape like this one, favoring small individuals or favoring big individuals. It can also be a mixture of this. It can be any kind of shape. But what really matters is that it should be consistent over generations. It should persist roughly the same kind, similar for many generations to be able to lead to a natural selection and to open the way to the third criterion, which is what we've been discussing in the first part of my lecture about heredity, the fact that babies resemble their parents. Big cats make bigger cats than small cats. This is important because there won't be, even if there is high selection pressure, like in the blue graph I just showed you, there might be no change in size of the trait, just because if the parents are not, if the babies do not resemble their parents in this trait. So resemblance is central to the concept of natural selection. And this is something that obviously Darwin had clearly understood. And the second important major process of evolution is drift, which is very similar to natural selection, but there is one important difference. Condition B is different. Instead of being selected according to the fitness, that is quality of the individuals, individuals are selected randomly, independently from their trait values, independently from their quality, the capacity to have offspring. And this process is very efficient and influential in all populations, but particularly in small populations. And this is why it is so important in conservation biology. And this will be the topic of the next lecture of this module. So now we can apply this natural selection concept to cultural variance. And we need the three conditions to be fulfilled. So there should be variation, no big problem. We know about change, cultural change, innovations. We know also that there are, for instance, in terms of languages, I think there are more than 4,000 different languages identified on the Earth, so no problem about this one. There might be some selective pressure. And for instance, if you want to understand this lecture, you'd better speak English and understand English. But the most important one is that cultural variants are made inclusively heritable by social learning itself. In other words, I inherit of the cultural variance of my parents. And there was a topic that we discussed among all of us when we were preparing this module. And there is an important point that I want to state here and to specify. The fact that social learning can lead to cultural evolution only if variants or their descendants persist across generations in order to produce traditions, that is, commonalities in behavior of all the individuals within a population. They behave the same way in such or such situation. The important point is that we discussed is that this cultural variant might also evolve within a generation, no doubt about that. But what is important is that the new one is just a descendant somehow of the previous one. So it's the same culture, it's the same cultural variant that is slightly modified step by step. So this explains why classically we say that only cultural variants that persist or accumulate or change, evolve over generations can produce cultural evolution. And this then opens a new definition of animal culture, evolution, which is an inclusive definition of evolution, which is the process by which the frequencies of variance change over generations. Not only genes, any kind of variance. It could be genetic variance, or it could be cultural variance, epigenetic variance, microbiota variance, any kind of process that is transmitted across generations, any kind of variance that is transmitted, for which babies resemble their parents. coming back to the slide before the last, there is one thing I'd like to highlight in this slide, which is the fact that in this slide, in all these processes of evolution, variation is central, is key. It's all over the place in all these criteria. It is thus important to study again the sources of phenotypic variation. We've already tackled this question in the first part of this lecture, but now I did it at a given moment. Now I want to place this in time to study dynamics, the dynamics of it. And for this I need a time scale which is there from left to right on the x-axis of this graph. The time is in log 10 of numbers of generations, meaning that 1 means 10 generations ago, 2 means 100 generations ago, and 7 would mean 10 million generations ago. So it's a really broad time scale. And on the y-axis, you've got the phenotypic variation, what we've been discussing during the first part of this lecture, V sub p. And of course, time 0 is a time of fertilization of the organism we are studying now. It could be you and I, and the present time is here. And we know from what we've said in the first part that within the modern synthesis of evolution, which is the current mainstream vision of the mechanisms of evolution, there are two important components that explain phenotypic variation. The fact that we do not all have the same genes, this is a light blue area here, and the fact that we don't have the same, we didn't live and develop in the same environment. This is the green area in this diagram. So until now, this is classical. But now I'd like to think a little bit about this period. It seems to me that environmental information gathered by my recent ancestors, my father, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, recent ancestors, is likely to be far more up-to-date than the information that was gathered by some of my ancestors that lived millions of generations before. So it means that the environment gathered experienced by my recent ancestors is likely to be a far better predictor of the environment in which I will be living. This means that if my ancestors acquired the capacity to transmit me information about the environment, oh guy, be careful, the environment is extremely dry at the moment, and it's been for at least 2 or 3 generations. So I kind of shape your phenotype, fine-tune your gene expression so that you are better adapted to this dry environment. An organism that would be able to do this would have a selective advantage that would be extremely strong, and it should exist in nature. But if I say this, you will immediately say, oh my God, this is Lamarckism. You're not allowed to say this. It's evil. But I focus on facts, and scientists focus on facts. Facts are there, and there is no way to forget about them. And there is accruing evidence for the inheritance of recent environmental effects that are inherited across several generations. And we've discussed this again in the first part of this lecture. So it means that, for instance, this is a case of animal culture. Animal culture, we've seen in lecture 8, for instance, about insects, that some modeling suggests that a tradition may last for thousands of generations. So it would place it somewhere here. And if I had the time, I would have been able to present examples about parental effects that are known to last for at least 10 generations, or inherited responses to environmental stress that can persist for at least 100 generations. So it would be there. So all this means that this green area, which means area in which there is a change under the effect of the environment, a change in the fine-tuning of gene expression during development or within an organism, it means that this green area should be expanded far back in time, a bit like this. And if we say this way, you suddenly find again the variance decomposition I showed in the first part. You got the part which is non-transmitted, which Darwin said it was we could get rid of. Here is the green box I discussed a little bit, the fact that there are non-genetic processes of parent-offspring resemblance, and of course there are the genes V sub G. And development is there, and my goal is to convince you that beyond the effect of genes in blue here and green here, dark green here, there are also other effects which are transmitted by recent ancestors according to their history of recent ancestors. And this is through non-genetic inheritance. So it's time to recapitulate now. On the left part, it's really long time scale, and it's the domain of what I could call neo-Darwinism, which is another word to qualify the modern synthesis of evolution. It's a mixture of Darwinism, natural selection, and genes. The main information there is DNA sequence. It's called genetic inheritance, and it's purely irreversible, almost entirely irreversible. On the right side, on the other hand, you've got a process that I could call neo-Lamarckian, because it involves the acquisition of some traits that can be transmitted later on. And there, the main molecule that is emerging as a major molecule of memory in biology is RNA. It's been overlooked, but it's now emerging as a major molecule of memory in biology. And the interesting point of these processes is that they are reversible. You can come back to a past situation very easily, or more or less easily, according to the different processes. And once you've presented the thing that way, you now realize that, in fact, there is no more tension between Darwinism and Lamarckism. We also always oppose them as it is either one or the other, but they might work together because they're complementary. They work in different time scales. Short term, it's more Lamarckian processes, and long term, it's engraving within the neo-Darwinism vision of things. And more importantly, even more so, because in fact, these two processes are talking to each other. Obviously, genes can affect and do affect the processes of non-genetic inheritance, but also processes of non-genetic inheritance might facilitate change in DNA sequence as well. So clearly they talk to each other, and they need to be unified. And I'd like to unify them under a single umbrella that we could call Darwinism. Darwinism, because Darwin had a much broader vision of inheritance than we have now, because he didn't know anything about the genes, and he wrote more sentences, more pages that were entirely Lamarckian in his vision. And this is why this diagram represents the informational dynamics within the inclusive evolutionary synthesis, and I will say a few words about this to conclude. You remember this diagram we saw in the beginning? Only one red arrow linking generations, genes, the DNA sequence. We later added culture, and we said that it's got some specific properties that clearly have the possibility to change the dynamics. But if I had had time, I would have been able to convince you of the existence of many other red arrows, many other pathways of information across generations. And now imagine that you are a modeler and you want to model informational dynamics, which is the goal of any evolutionary model, in a world like this or in a world like that. One doesn't need to be a good mathematician to realize that these equations won't be similar. They will be significantly different, and their properties might be quite different. Well, we have some ideas about the fact that indeed the properties might be different, but this has to be explored entirely. So we are, in fact, now living an ongoing conceptual leap, a really major leap in biology. I tend to compare it to the period in the 1940s and 1950s when they were cracking the genetic code. We are now cracking the non-genetic codes, epigenetic codes, cultural code, and a suite of other processes that are affecting parent offspring resemblance. And we thus need to keep on multidimensionalizing inheritance to implement what I call the inclusive evolutionary synthesis, which is just a modernization, a generalization of the modern synthesis of evolution. It doesn't say that the modern synthesis of evolution is wrong. It just says that it is too specific. It has to be generalized. And of course, it should be generalized in order to include any kind of processes we are aware of parent offspring resemblance. And one of them, of course, is animal culture, which, as we've seen, has got unique properties that are likely to strongly affect the process of evolution in itself. So now I'd like to finish with, you remember that I started with this question, what does the existence of cultural inheritance change in evolution? And in fact, I didn't reply to that question. It's because we are now just starting to be able to answer that question. We now have the tools and concepts to do it. But this is just the beginning, and particularly in terms of empirical studies, I don't know of a single experimental study that was dedicated to studying the consequences of cultural in evolution per se yet. There are some theoretical studies, as I said before, but in terms of data, we are just describing the process at the moment. So it's an entirely open, a new continent that it's down to you, younger students, to explore now. And the goal of this whole module is to convince you of the importance of this process and the fact that there are interesting, fantastic discoveries to make in this new continent. So I have to thank my institutions, and I want to thank you for your attention. And here is the list of references that I cited in this lecture.